It all began on a glamorous night in New York, when Claire Belmont, against her own will, stepped onto the stage of a charity auction. Among competitive bids, a mysterious man stunned everyone by offering a true fortune for a simple dinner. Julian Moray's unexpected gesture not only changed the course of that evening, but forever transformed the destiny of them both. The crystal chandeliers of the Plaza Hotel cast golden shadows across the marble floors, each beam of light seeming to dance with the elegance of New York's elite gathered for the annual Children's Hope Foundation Gala. Claire Belmont stood near the grand staircase, her fingers nervously adjusting the delicate silver bracelet on her wrist as she surveyed the opulent ballroom filled with Manhattan's most influential figures. At 26, Claire possessed a natural grace that had nothing to do with the designer gown she wore, a flowing emerald silk dress that complemented her chestnut hair and brought out the warmth in her hazel eyes. Having recently returned from Switzerland, where she had lived with her mother, following her parents' bitter divorce, she still felt like a stranger in her own country. Navigating the complex relationship with her father, Richard Belmont, a real estate magnate whose controlling nature had driven her away years ago. "You look like you're planning your escape route," came the familiar voice of Camilla Evans, her best friend since childhood, who appeared beside her with 2 glasses of champagne. Camilla's dark eyes sparkled with mischief as she nudged Claire's shoulder. "Come on, this is supposed to be fun. When was the last time you actually enjoyed yourself?" Claire accepted the champagne with a grateful smile, though her eyes remained cautious. "I'm still adjusting to all this again. Father insisted I accompany him tonight, and you know how these events make me feel, like I'm on display." "That's because you are stunning, and every man in this room has noticed," Camilla said with a knowing grin. "Speaking of which, they're about to start the charity auction. I heard they're doing something different this year. Dinner dates with eligible women to raise money for the orphanages." "Absolutely not," Claire said immediately, shaking her head. "I'm not participating in some medieval auction where men bid on women like cattle. If this story is touching your heart, show your support. Leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and share it with your friends. Every action helps us keep bringing you new stories full of emotion." But Camilla was already pulling her toward the stage area where other women were gathering. "It's for charity, Claire. Besides, what's the worst that could happen? You have dinner with some boring businessman and help raise money for children who need it." Before Claire could protest further, the auctioneer was calling for volunteers, and somehow, between Camilla's persuasive arguments about the children and Claire's own guilt about her privileged life, she found herself reluctantly walking toward the stage steps. From across the room, Julian Moray had been only half listening to his business partner's conversation about quarterly reports when movement near the stage caught his attention. At 38, Julian commanded respect in every room he entered. His aviation company, Skyward Enterprises, was one of the largest in the United States, and his reputation as a shrewd businessman was matched only by his skill as a pilot, a passion he had never abandoned despite his corporate success. Standing 6'3" with an athletic build maintained through rigorous physical discipline, Julian had the kind of commanding presence that made people step aside when he walked by. His dark hair was perfectly styled, though a few rebellious strands always seemed to fall across his forehead, and his amber eyes, the color of aged whiskey, had a way of seeing through people's facades to their core. But as Claire stepped onto the stage, something shifted in Julian's chest. The confident businessman who had conquered boardrooms and commanded aircraft suddenly found his breath catching. She moved with an understated elegance that seemed effortless. Her head held high despite what he could sense was her discomfort with the situation. There was something in her posture, proud yet vulnerable, that spoke to a part of him he had long buried. "Ladies and gentlemen," the auctioneer announced, "our first volunteer is Miss Claire Belmont, recently returned from Switzerland and currently working with her father's legal firm. The bidding starts at $5,000 for an evening of fine dining with this lovely lady." Julian's hands tightened involuntarily around his whiskey glass as the bidding began. 5,000 quickly became 10, then 20. Each raised hand in the audience sent an unexpected surge of possessiveness through him, a feeling so foreign and intense that it nearly made him step back in surprise. Claire stood on the stage trying to maintain her composure, her cheeks flushed with embarrassment, as strange men called out increasingly higher amounts. She could feel her father's disapproving gaze from somewhere in the crowd, and part of her wanted to flee entirely. This was exactly the kind of spectacle she had hoped to avoid in returning to New York. $50,000, called out a voice from the middle of the room, and Claire's eyes found the bidder, a silver-haired man in his 60s who was looking at her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. The bidding seemed to slow, and Claire felt a mixture of relief and mortification that this ordeal would soon be over. But then a voice cut through the murmur of the crowd, deep, authoritative, and completely steady. $500,000. The entire ballroom fell into stunned silence. Claire's gaze swept the room until it landed on a tall figure in the front row. Julian Moray stood with casual confidence, his amber eyes locked directly on hers with an intensity that sent electricity racing down her spine. He wasn't smiling, wasn't showing off. He simply stood there as if he had just stated the most natural thing in the world. The auctioneer's voice cracked slightly as he called out, $500,000 from Mr. Moray. Do I hear any other bids? The silence stretched on until he finally brought down his gavel. Sold to Mr. Julian Moray. As applause erupted around the room, Claire found she couldn't look away from the man who had just paid an astronomical sum for the privilege of taking her to dinner. His gaze never wavered from hers, and in that moment she felt as if they were the only two people in the room. Julian's business partner leaned over and whispered, "Have you completely lost your mind? $500,000 for a dinner date?" But Julian barely heard him. As Claire descended from the stage, moving toward him through the crowd that parted like water before her, he realized that for the first time in his adult life, he had acted purely on instinct rather than calculated strategy. And the strangest part was, he didn't regret it at all. When she finally stood before him, close enough that he could catch the subtle scent of her perfume, something light and floral that seemed to suit her perfectly, Julian extended his hand. "Julian Moray," he said simply, his voice low and warm. "Claire Belmont," she replied, placing her hand in his. The contact sent warmth shooting up her arm, and she quickly pulled away, disconcerted by her own reaction. "That was quite generous of you, Mr. Moray." "It's for the children," he said, though they both knew that wasn't entirely true. "I hope tomorrow evening works for you. I was thinking the River Cafe in Brooklyn, unless you have other preferences." Claire studied his face, searching for signs of the arrogance she expected from a man who had just spent $500,000 as casually as ordering coffee. Instead, she found something unexpected, a hint of uncertainty beneath the confident exterior, as if he too was surprised by his own actions. "Tomorrow evening is fine," she heard herself saying, though part of her mind was screaming that this was a terrible idea. As Julian smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his austere features, Claire realized that whatever game this was, the rules had just changed completely, and for the first time since returning to New York, she felt truly awake. The River Cafe sat like a jewel on the Brooklyn waterfront, its windows offering an unobstructed view of Manhattan's glittering skyline across the East River. Claire arrived precisely on time, her punctuality a small act of rebellion against the chaos this mysterious dinner had created in her normally ordered world. She had chosen a simple black dress, elegant but not ostentatious, and her hair fell in soft waves around her shoulders. Julian was already waiting at their reserved table, and the sight of him made her breath catch slightly. In the formal setting of the charity gala, he had seemed intimidating, almost larger than life. Here, in the intimate lighting of the restaurant, he appeared no less commanding but somehow more human. His dark suit was impeccably tailored, and when he rose to greet her, she noticed he moved with the fluid grace of someone completely comfortable in his own skin. "Miss Belmont," he said, pulling out her chair, "you look beautiful." "Thank you," Claire replied, settling into her seat and immediately focusing on the view rather than the man across from her. "This is lovely. I haven't been here since I was a teenager." Julian took his seat, studying her profile as she gazed out at the city lights. In the golden glow of the restaurant's lighting, she was even more captivating than she had been on the auction stage. But there was something guarded about her posture, a carefully maintained distance that intrigued him more than any overt flirtation could have. "So," he said, leaning back slightly, "tell me what brings a woman back from Switzerland to New York. Most people seem to prefer the reverse journey these days." Claire turned to face him, and Julian caught his first clear look at her eyes, hazel with flecks of gold that seemed to shift in the light. They were intelligent eyes, he realized, and currently sizing him up with careful calculation. "Family obligations," she said simply. "My father needed assistance with some projects, and I thought it was time to come home." She paused, then added with a slight smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, "Besides, I imagine a man who pays $500,000 for a dinner date is accustomed to getting detailed explanations from women." Julian nearly choked on his wine, surprised by the directness of her attack. He set down his glass and studied her with newfound respect. "Touché, though I have to say, most women don't usually open with accusations of treating them like purchased commodities." "Most women probably haven't been auctioned off to the highest bidder," Claire countered smoothly. "I'm curious, do you make a habit of such dramatic gestures, or am I a special case?" The verbal sparring was unlike anything Julian had experienced. In his world of corporate negotiations and strategic partnerships, conversations were calculated, predictable. Claire's directness was refreshing and completely disarming. He found himself leaning forward, genuinely engaged in a way he hadn't been in years. "You're definitely a special case," he admitted, his amber eyes meeting hers steadily. "I've never bid on anything at a charity auction before, let alone a dinner date." "Then why last night?" Claire asked, genuinely curious despite herself. She had expected him to be like every other wealthy, powerful man she had encountered, smooth, predictable, ultimately boring. Instead, she was finding herself drawn into a conversation that felt more like a chess match than small talk. Julian was quiet for a moment, his fingers tracing the rim of his wine glass. "Honest answer. I saw you up there looking like you'd rather be anywhere else in the world, and something about that resonated with me. You didn't belong in that artificial spectacle any more than—" He paused, seeming to catch himself. "Any more than what?" Claire pressed. "Any more than I belonged in that room full of people pretending to care about charity while showing off their wealth," he finished, meeting her gaze directly. The admission surprised them both. Julian, who had built his success on maintaining careful control over what he revealed, had just offered a glimpse behind his perfectly constructed facade. And Claire, who had armed herself with sarcasm and distance, felt her defenses waver slightly. "That's a rather cynical view of charitable giving," she said, though her tone had softened. "Is it cynical or realistic?" Julian asked. "How many of those people do you think have ever actually visited the orphanages they were supposedly supporting last night?" Claire considered this, remembering the conversations she had overheard at the gala, discussions about stock portfolios and vacation homes, rather than the children the event was meant to help. "Point taken," she conceded, "though that raises the question of why you were there at all." "Business networking," Julian said with a self-deprecating smile. "See, I'm just as guilty as the rest of them." "At least you're honest about it," Claire said, and for the first time that evening, her smile was genuine. As their conversation continued through dinner, Claire found herself reluctantly impressed by Julian's intelligence and surprising candor. He spoke about his aviation company with genuine passion, describing his early days as a pilot with an enthusiasm that transformed his entire demeanor. When he talked about flying, his amber eyes lit up and his usually controlled expression became animated. "You still fly?" Claire asked, drawn in despite herself. "Every chance I get," Julian replied. "There's something about being up there, just you in the sky and the machine responding to every subtle command. It's the closest thing to perfect freedom I've ever experienced." Claire found herself imagining him in the cockpit of a plane, those capable hands on the controls, completely in his element. The image was surprisingly appealing, and she quickly pushed the thought away. "And what about you?" Julian asked. "What did you do in Switzerland besides perfect your pointed observations about American businessmen?" "I worked for an art acquisition firm," Claire said. "We helped private collectors and museums locate and authenticate pieces. It was challenging work, part detective story, part art history, part international diplomacy." "Sounds infinitely more interesting than most people's jobs," Julian observed. "Do you miss it?" "Sometimes," Claire admitted. There was something appealing about the work being focused on beauty and history rather than— She gestured vaguely at the expensive restaurant around them. "Rather than money and power," Julian finished with a knowing look. "Exactly." As dessert arrived, their conversation had evolved into something that felt almost comfortable. The verbal sparring had given way to genuine curiosity about each other. Claire found herself studying Julian's hands as he spoke, noting the small scar on his left index finger. the way his fingers moved when he was making a point. These were working hands, she realized, despite his wealth and position. "I have to ask," Claire said suddenly, "do you always analyze people this thoroughly on first dates?" "Is that what this is?" Julian asked, his tone carefully neutral. "A date?" Claire felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I suppose that's what dinner between two adults is generally called, yes." "In that case," Julian said, his voice dropping to a lower, more intimate register, "I should probably mention that I never expected to find beauty and intelligence so naturally combined in one person." The compliment, delivered without flourish or obvious charm, hit Claire harder than any smooth pickup line could have. She felt something flutter in her chest, a warmth she immediately tried to suppress. "And I should probably mention that powerful men usually underestimate women out of habit," she replied, though her tone had lost some of its earlier sharpness. Julian leaned back in his chair, studying her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "You're not going to make this easy, are you?" "Make what easy?" Claire asked, though she suspected she knew exactly what he meant. "Getting to know you better." The words hung in the air between them, charged with possibility and challenge. Claire felt her pulse quicken, and for a moment she allowed herself to imagine what it might be like to let her guard down with this complex, intriguing man. But then, reality reasserted itself. Julian Moray was exactly the kind of man she had spent years avoiding. Wealthy, powerful, used to getting what he wanted. Her father had taught her too well what happened when strong-willed women tried to coexist with men who expected the world to bend to their will. "Mr. Moray," she said, her voice returning to its earlier formality, "this has been a lovely evening, but I think we should both be clear about what this is. You made a generous donation to charity, we've had dinner, and now we can both return to our respective lives." Julian's expression didn't change, but Claire caught a flicker of something. Disappointment, frustration, in his amber eyes before his businessman's mask slipped back into place. "Of course," he said smoothly, signaling for the check, "though I hope you'll allow me to see you home safely." As they waited for his car, standing on the restaurant's terrace with Manhattan's skyline glittering across the water, Claire felt an unexpected pang of regret. The evening had been far more engaging than she had expected, and Julian far more complex than she had assumed. "Thank you for dinner," she said quietly as his driver approached. Julian stepped closer, and suddenly Claire was very aware of his height, his presence, the way he seemed to create his own gravity that pulled her toward him. For a moment she thought he might kiss her, and more surprisingly she realized part of her wanted him to. Instead he simply said, "The pleasure was entirely mine, Claire, and despite what you said in there, I don't think this is over." As the car pulled away from the curb, carrying her back toward Manhattan, Claire touched her lips unconsciously and wondered if he was right. 3 days had passed since the dinner at the River Café, and Claire had almost convinced herself that she had successfully compartmentalized the entire evening as a one-time charity obligation. Almost. The problem was that Julian Moray had an inconvenient way of lingering in her thoughts at the most inappropriate moments. While she was reviewing legal documents at her father's firm during her morning coffee, in the quiet moments before sleep, when his amber eyes and that almost kiss seemed to materialize from nowhere. She was determined to put him out of her mind entirely, as she made her way to Belmont and Associates on Thursday morning, her arms full of files that needed organizing for her father's latest real estate acquisition. The law firm occupied 2 floors of a prestigious midtown building, and Claire had been helping with administrative tasks while she figured out her next career move. The morning was progressing normally until she stepped out of the elevator on the 32nd floor and nearly collided with a familiar tall figure examining the building directory. "Miss Belmont," Julian said, turning toward her with what appeared to be genuine surprise, though Claire noticed his eyes held a hint of something that looked suspiciously like satisfaction. What an unexpected pleasure. Claire felt her pulse quicken involuntarily, annoyed by her body's immediate response to his presence. He was dressed in a charcoal business suit that emphasized his broad shoulders, and his dark hair looked slightly windswept, as if he had just come in from outside. "Mr. Moray," she replied coolly, tightening her grip on the files in her arms. "Are you lost? This is a law firm, not an aviation company." Julian's mouth curved into the beginning of a smile. Actually, I have a meeting with Richard Belmont about some property acquisitions for Skyward. We're expanding our East Coast operations. He paused, his amber eyes studying her face. I had no idea his daughter worked here. Temporarily, Claire said quickly, not wanting him to think she was some sort of nepotistic hire living off her father's success. I'm just helping with some organizational projects while I transition back to New York. Of course, Julian said, and Claire couldn't tell if she was imagining the amusement in his voice. Well, I should let you get to your organizational projects. But as Claire moved toward the reception desk, Julian called her name softly. She turned back reluctantly. Claire, he said, and the way he said her first name, with careful attention to each syllable, sent an unwelcome shiver down her spine. I hope you don't mind my saying that you look beautiful this morning. Before she could formulate a suitable response that would maintain her professional composure and discourage his attention, Julian was walking toward the conference rooms, leaving Claire standing in the hallway with her heart beating faster than she cared to admit. The meeting between Julian and her father lasted 2 hours, during which Claire found herself completely unable to concentrate on the contract revisions she was supposed to be reviewing. Every time she heard voices from the conference room, she strained to catch Julian's deep tones among the conversation. It was ridiculous, she told herself firmly. She was acting like a teenager with a crush. When the meeting finally ended, Claire made sure to be busy at the filing cabinets with her back turned as the men emerged. She could hear her father's voice, formal and businesslike, discussing timeline and next steps, and then Julian's voice, closer than she expected. Thank you for your time, Richard. I look forward to working together. A pause. Please give my regards to your daughter. Claire's cheeks burned, but she kept her attention focused on the files in front of her until she heard the elevator doors close. Claire, her father's voice called from behind her. A word in my office, please. Richard Belmont's corner office was a testament to his success, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park, expensive furniture, walls lined with awards and photographs of him, with various politicians and business leaders. Claire had always found the space intimidating, which she suspected was entirely intentional. Julian Moret mentioned he had dinner with you recently, Richard said without preamble, as Claire settled into the chair across from his mahogany desk. He was quite complimentary. Claire felt her stomach tighten. She should have anticipated that Julian would mention their dinner to her father. It was the kind of professional courtesy that men in their circle extended to each other. It was a charity auction, father, nothing more. Richard leaned back in his leather chair, studying his daughter with the same calculating expression he used in business negotiations. Julian Moret is one of the most successful men in aviation. Skyward Enterprises is worth over $2 billion, and he's built it all himself. A connection like that could be advantageous. I'm not interested in being advantageous to anyone, Claire said firmly, recognizing the tone in her father's voice that had driven her to Switzerland in the first place. And I'm certainly not interested in being used as some sort of business networking tool. Don't be naive, Claire, Richard replied dismissively. Marriage is always partly about strategic alliances. Your mother never understood that, which is why our marriage ultimately failed. Claire felt anger flare in her chest. Maybe it failed because you treated her like a business acquisition rather than a person you loved. The words hung in the air between them, and Claire immediately regretted letting her emotions get the better of her. Richard's expression hardened, and she could see the disapproval that had shadowed most of their interactions since her return from Switzerland. You would do well to remember, Claire, that I'm trying to help you establish yourself in New York society. Men like Julian Moret don't remain single forever, and when they do marry, they choose women who understand the value of partnership. Partnership implies equality, Claire said quietly, something you've never understood. Before her father could respond, Claire stood and walked out of his office, her hands shaking slightly with suppressed anger. She gathered her purse and coat from her desk, ignoring the curious glances from other staff members, and headed for the elevators. She needed air, space, and time to think without the oppressive weight of her father's expectations pressing down on her. The last thing she needed was Richard trying to orchestrate her personal life, as if she were another one of his real estate deals. But as the elevator descended toward the lobby, Claire couldn't shake the memory of Julian's voice saying her name, or the way his eyes had seemed to see straight through her carefully constructed defenses. And despite her father's heavy-handed matchmaking attempts, she found herself wondering what it would be like to see Julian again, on her own terms, without the complications of family expectations or business obligations. The thought was both thrilling and terrifying, and Claire realized she was in far more trouble than she had initially thought. By the time she reached the street level, she had made a decision that surprised even her. If Julian Moray wanted to pursue whatever had started between them at the River Cafe, he was going to have to work for it. And he was going to have to prove that he saw her as more than just another conquest or business advantage. She had no way of knowing that at that exact moment, 32 floors above her, Julian was standing at the conference room window watching her emerge onto the sidewalk below, thinking almost exactly the same thing. The small cafe on the Upper East Side had become Claire's refuge during her first weeks back in New York. Tucked between a bookstore and a flower shop, it was unpretentious and comfortable, the kind of place where she could disappear with a book and a cappuccino without worrying about running into anyone from her father's social circle, which was why she was completely unprepared to look up from her laptop Friday afternoon to find Julian Moray approaching her corner table, carrying his own coffee and wearing an expression that managed to be both apologetic and determined. "Before you tell me this is stalking," he said without preamble, settling into the empty chair across from her, "I should mention that my office is 3 blocks from here, and I've been getting coffee at this place for 2 years. Claire closed her laptop slowly, studying his face for signs of deception. He was dressed more casually than she had seen him before, dark jeans, a navy sweater that emphasized his broad shoulders, and a leather jacket draped over the back of his chair. The informal attire made him seem more approachable, which was either very good or very dangerous. "Convenient coincidence," she said finally. "Not entirely," Julian admitted, taking a sip of his coffee. "I may have adjusted my usual schedule slightly, in hopes of running into you." Despite herself, Claire felt the corner of her mouth twitch upward. "At least you're honest about your manipulation techniques." "I prefer to think of it as strategic persistence," Julian replied, and there was something in his tone, a hint of self-deprecating humor, that disarmed her more effectively than any smooth line could have. "Is that what you call it in the business world?" Claire asked, leaning back in her chair and regarding him with curious eyes. "Strategic persistence." "Among other things," Julian said. "Though I have to admit, most of my business negotiations don't involve nearly this much uncertainty about the outcome." "And you don't like uncertainty," Claire observed. Julian was quiet for a moment, his amber eyes studying her face with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "Usually, no, but you're making me reconsider my position on that." The admission hung between them, more intimate than it had any right to be in a crowded coffee shop. Claire felt heat rise in her cheeks and took a sip of her cappuccino to buy herself time to think. "Julian," she said finally, using his first name deliberately, "what exactly do you want from me?" The question was direct enough to catch him off guard. Julian had built his success on being able to read people, anticipate their moves, stay 3 steps ahead in every negotiation. But Claire's straightforward challenge left him momentarily speechless. "I want to get to know you," he said finally. "Beyond the careful distance you maintain and the armor you wear to keep people from getting too close." "That's quite an assumption," Claire said, though her voice lacked conviction. "Is it wrong?" Claire met his gaze directly, seeing something there that made her chest tighten. Julian Moray was looking at her, as if she were a puzzle he genuinely wanted to solve, not a conquest he planned to claim. The distinction was subtle but significant. "Why?" she asked quietly. "Why me specifically? You could have dinner with any woman in New York." Julian leaned forward slightly, his forearms resting on the small table. "Because every other woman I've met in the last 5 years has told me exactly what she thought I wanted to hear. You told me I was predictable and criticized my motivations for attending charity events. Do you have any idea how refreshing that was?" Claire couldn't help but smile at that. Most men would call that insulting, not refreshing. Most men haven't spent the better part of a decade surrounded by people who agree with everything they say because they want something in return, Julian replied. "Your honesty was unexpected. And you like unexpected things?" Julian's expression grew more serious. "I'm beginning to think I need unexpected things more than I realized." Before Claire could respond to that surprisingly vulnerable admission, her phone buzzed with a text message. She glanced at it automatically and felt her expression tighten with annoyance. "Problem?" Julian asked, noting the change in her demeanor. "My father," Claire said, setting the phone aside without responding to the message. "He's arranged for me to have lunch tomorrow with someone he thinks would be a suitable connection for me. Apparently, my social calendar requires his management." Julian felt something dark and possessive stir in his chest at the thought of Claire having lunch with another man, especially one chosen by her father. The intensity of his reaction surprised him, but he kept his voice carefully controlled. "And you're going?" "I haven't decided," Claire said, then looked at him with sudden curiosity. "Actually, that raises an interesting question. What exactly did you and my father discuss in your meeting yesterday?" Julian had been dreading this question, knowing it would come up eventually. "Business, mostly. Property acquisitions for my company's expansion." He paused, then added reluctantly, "He did mention that you were adjusting well to being back in New York." "That's all," Claire pressed, sensing there was more. Julian sighed, running a hand through his dark hair. "He may have mentioned that you were single, and that he thought we would get along well." Claire felt heat rise in her cheeks, this time from embarrassment and anger rather than attraction. "Of course he did. I'm sorry you were subjected to my father's matchmaking attempts. He has a tendency to treat my personal life as another business opportunity." "Claire," Julian said gently, reaching across the table to touch her hand briefly, "I want you to know that whatever your father's motivations were, they have nothing to do with why I'm here right now. I'm here because I haven't been able to stop thinking about our dinner, about the way you challenge me, about the way you look at the world." The sincerity in his voice made Claire's anger begin to fade, replaced by something warmer and more dangerous. Julian's hand was still covering hers, and she could feel the calluses on his fingers, evidence of his piloting days that somehow made him seem more real, more grounded. "This is complicated," she said softly. "It doesn't have to be," Julian replied. "Have dinner with me tomorrow night. Not because of anything your father arranged or suggested, but because you want to. Just us. No expectations, no pressure." Claire studied his face, searching for signs of the calculating businessman she expected to find. Instead, she saw something that looked almost like hope, carefully contained, but unmistakably present. "Where?" she heard herself ask. Julian's smile transformed his entire expression. "There's a little Italian place in the village. Nothing fancy, no chance of running into anyone from either of our professional circles. Just good food and a chance to continue this conversation without interruption. No $500,000 gestures," Claire asked with a slight smile. "Just dinner," Julian promised, "though I reserve the right to pay for it like a normal person." As Claire gathered her things to leave, Julian stood as well, and suddenly they were standing very close in the narrow space between the tables. For a moment, the noise of the coffee shop seemed to fade, and Claire was acutely aware of Julian's height, his presence, the way he was looking at her as if she were the most fascinating thing in the room. "Tomorrow, then," she said, her voice slightly breathless. "Tomorrow," Julian agreed, his voice low and warm in a way that made her stomach flutter. As Claire walked away, Julian remained standing by the table, watching her until she disappeared around the corner. For the first time in years, he found himself looking forward to something that had nothing to do with business, profit margins, or strategic advantage. And for the first time since returning to New York, Claire found herself genuinely excited about something, rather than simply going through the motions of rebuilding her life. Neither of them noticed the photographer across the street, capturing their interaction through the cafe window for the society pages of tomorrow's paper. The Italian restaurant Julian had chosen was everything he had promised: small, intimate, and completely removed from the glittering world of Manhattan high society. Located on a quiet side street in Greenwich Village, it had checkered tablecloths, candles in wine bottles, and the kind of authentic atmosphere that couldn't be manufactured by expensive interior designers. Claire arrived to find Julian already waiting at a corner table, and she was struck again by how different he seemed outside the formal environments where she had previously encountered him. He wore dark jeans and a simple white button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled up, revealing strong forearms that spoke of physical work rather than just boardroom negotiations. "This is perfect," Claire said, as he stood to greet her, gesturing to the cozy restaurant around them. "How did you find this place?" "I used to live a few blocks from here when I was starting the company," Julian said, pulling out her chair. Before Skyward took off, I survived on pasta and ambition for about 2 years. Claire settled into her seat, intrigued by this glimpse into Julian's past. That's hard to imagine. You seem so established. I wasn't always a successful businessman, Julian said with a self-deprecating smile. 15 years ago, I was just a pilot with a business degree and an idea that everyone told me was impossible. As they ordered wine and perused the menu, Claire found herself genuinely curious about Julian's journey from struggling entrepreneur to aviation mogul. There was something appealing about imagining him younger, less polished, fighting to build something from nothing. "Tell me about the early days," she said, as their wine arrived. "What made you think you could compete with established aviation companies?" Julian's expression grew animated as he began to describe those challenging first years, the rejections from investors, the 18-hour days, the nights he slept on the office couch because he couldn't afford both an apartment and office space. "The breakthrough came when I landed a contract with a small medical transport company," Julian explained, his amber eyes bright with the memory. "They needed someone who could fly in difficult conditions, handle emergency situations. The established companies were too big, too bureaucratic, but I was desperate enough to say yes to anything." "And you built the entire company from that one contract?" Claire asked, fascinated despite herself. "Eventually," Julian said. "It took 8 years before I could afford to hire someone else to do the flying for me. Even now, I still pilot some of our more challenging routes personally." Claire found herself studying Julian's hands as he spoke, hands that had controlled aircraft through storms and emergencies, that had built a business from nothing. There was something deeply attractive about his competence, his willingness to work for what he wanted. "What about you?" Julian asked, turning the conversation toward her. "What made you choose art acquisition in Switzerland?" Claire hesitated, swirling the wine in her glass. "Honestly, it was as far away from my father's world as I could get while still using my art history degree. I wanted to do something that mattered beyond profit margins and social status." "Did you succeed?" Julian asked gently. "For a while," Claire said. "There's something pure about finding a lost masterpiece or helping reunite a family with artwork that was stolen during the war. But, Julian prompted when she trailed off. "But eventually I realized I was running away rather than building something meaningful," Claire admitted, surprised by her own honesty. "Switzerland was beautiful and peaceful, but it wasn't really living. It was hiding." Julian reached across the table and covered her hand with his, the gesture both comforting and intimate. "And now? Now I'm trying to figure out what living actually looks like," Claire said, very aware of the warmth of his touch. "Without my father's expectations dictating every choice." As their dinner arrived, the conversation flowed easily between them, more personal than their previous encounters, but still maintaining the intellectual sparring that had characterized their early interactions. Claire found herself relaxing in ways she hadn't expected, laughing at Julian's stories about difficult clients and sharing her own tales of eccentric art collectors. "I have a confession," Julian said as they shared tiramisu for dessert. "I may have asked around about you after our first dinner." Claire raised an eyebrow. "Should I be flattered or concerned about your investigative abilities?" "Probably both," Julian said with a grin. "But what I learned was interesting. Everyone who knows you describes you as intelligent, talented, and completely unimpressed by wealth or status. One person called you refreshingly immune to the usual social climbing." Who told you that?" Claire asked, curious despite herself. "Camilla Evans," Julian admitted. "I may have accidentally on purpose run into her at a gallery opening." Claire couldn't help but laugh. "You really are persistent." "Strategically persistent," Julian corrected with mock seriousness. "And completely smitten, if we're being honest." The admission hung between them, more serious than his playful tone suggested. Claire felt her breath catch, recognizing the shift in the conversation from casual to something much more significant. "Julian," she started, but he interrupted gently. "I know this is complicated," he said. "I know your father has his own agenda, and I know you have every reason to be suspicious of men like me. But I need you to know that whatever is happening between us has nothing to do with business or social connections or anything except the fact that I find you absolutely fascinating." Claire looked into his amber eyes and saw sincerity there, along with something that looked like vulnerability carefully held in check. "Julian Moret," who commanded boardrooms and aircraft with equal confidence, was nervous about her response. "You scare me," she said quietly, the admission slipping out before she could stop it. "Why?" Julian asked, his voice equally quiet. "Because I'm starting to care about you," Claire said, her honesty surprising them both. "And caring about powerful men has never worked out well for the women in my family." Julian leaned forward, his expression growing serious. "Claire, I need you to understand something. I don't want to control you, or change you, or make you into some idealized version of what I think a woman should be. I want to know the real you, the woman who challenges me, who sees through my corporate facade, who chose exile in Switzerland rather than compromise her principles." "And what if the real me disappoints you?" Claire asked, voicing her deepest fear. Julian reached up and traced the line of her jaw with gentle fingers, the touch sending electricity through her entire body. "Impossible," he said simply. For a moment, Claire thought he was going to kiss her. The air between them was charged with possibility, and she found herself leaning slightly toward him, her lips parting slightly in anticipation. But then Julian pulled back, his hand dropping to the table. "I should get you home," he said, his voice slightly rougher than usual. As they walked through the village streets toward Julian's waiting car, Claire felt both disappointed and relieved that he hadn't kissed her. She was falling for him. There was no point in denying it, but part of her was terrified by the intensity of her feelings and what they might mean for her carefully guarded independence. "Thank you for tonight," she said as they reached the car. "Thank you for giving me a chance," Julian replied, opening the passenger door for her, "despite your very reasonable reservations about my character." As the car pulled away from the curb, carrying them back toward her apartment on the Upper East Side, Claire realized that Julian Moray had become dangerous to her peace of mind, in ways she was only beginning to understand. And the most frightening part was that she was beginning not to care. Claire was reviewing acquisition documents at her father's law firm when her assistant knocked on her temporary office door, holding a massive arrangement of white orchids that must have cost more than most people's monthly rent. "These just arrived for you, Miss Belmont," the young woman said, setting the flowers on Claire's desk with obvious curiosity. Claire plucked the card from among the elegant blooms, immediately recognizing Julian's bold handwriting. "Thank you for a perfect evening. Looking forward to many more. J." Despite her best efforts to maintain emotional distance, Claire felt warmth bloom in her chest. The flowers were beautiful, sophisticated and understated rather than flashy, exactly the kind of gesture that showed Julian had been paying attention to her preferences. She was still smiling at the card when Camilla burst into her office without knocking, holding a copy of the New York Social Register with barely contained excitement. "Have you seen this?" Camilla demanded, dropping the magazine open to the society pages. "Because you're about to be very famous." Claire's smile faded as she saw the photograph, herself and Julian at the coffee shop the previous day, captured in the moment when he had reached across the table to touch her hand. The headline read, "Aviation Air Julian Moray's Mystery Woman. Who is Claire Belmont?" "Oh no," Claire said, sinking into her chair as she read the caption that detailed her return from Switzerland and described her as the latest romantic interest of one of New York's most eligible bachelors. "Oh yes," Camilla countered, clearly thrilled by her best friend's sudden notoriety. "Do you realize what this means? Julian Moray has been linked to exactly 3 women in the past 5 years, and they were all international supermodels or European nobility. The fact that he's been photographed looking at you like you hung the moon is going to make you the most talked-about woman in Manhattan." Before Claire could respond, her phone rang. The caller ID showed her father's office extension. "Claire, my office." "Now," Richard Belmont's voice was clipped and businesslike, but Claire could hear the underlying satisfaction that made her stomach turn. 5 minutes later, she was sitting across from her father's mahogany desk, the magazine spread open between them. Richard was leaning back in his leather chair with the expression of a man who had just won a particularly satisfying negotiation. "Julian Moray," he said without preamble. "I have to admit, Claire, I'm impressed. I didn't think you had it in you to secure such an advantageous connection so quickly." "It's not a connection, Father," Claire said firmly, "and I didn't secure anything. We've had dinner twice. That hardly constitutes a relationship worthy of your business calculations." "Don't be naive," Richard replied dismissively. Men like Julian Moray don't waste time on casual dinner companions. If he's been photographed with you, it means he's serious about his intentions. Claire felt anger rising in her chest. His intentions? What is this, the 19th century? Maybe Julian enjoys my company because I'm intelligent and interesting, not because I'm some sort of strategic acquisition. Of course, Richard said, in the patronizing tone that had driven her to Switzerland in the first place. I'm sure your sparkling personality is exactly what attracted a billionaire who could have dinner with any woman in the world. Before Claire could formulate a response that wouldn't result in her storming out of the office, her phone buzzed with a text message from Julian. Saw the magazine. I'm sorry about the intrusion. Can we talk? That's him, isn't it? Richard observed, noting her expression. I suggest you answer promptly. Men of his caliber don't appreciate being kept waiting. Claire stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the hardwood floor. I'm not managing Julian Moray like a business client, father. And I'm certainly not going to shape my behavior based on your antiquated ideas about what powerful men expect from women. She was halfway to the door when Richard's voice stopped her. Claire, he said, his tone slightly softer but no less controlling. I know you think I'm being manipulative, but I'm trying to protect your future. Julian Moray could provide you with security, status, everything you need to establish yourself in New York society. What if I don't want those things? Claire asked, turning back to face him. What if I want to build my own life, make my own choices, succeed based on my own merits, rather than who I marry? Then you'll end up like your mother, Richard said bluntly. Divorced, lonely, and struggling to maintain the lifestyle you were born to. The words hit Claire like a physical blow, and she saw her father immediately recognize that he had gone too far. But the damage was done. The familiar feelings of inadequacy and suffocation that had driven her away from New York came flooding back. Without another word, Claire gathered her purse and coat and walked out of the office, ignoring her father's calls for her to return. She needed air, space, and time to think without Richard's expectations pressing down on her like a physical weight. As she walked through Midtown toward Central Park, Claire tried to sort through her tangled emotions about Julian, her father, and the unwanted publicity that was threatening to complicate everything. Her phone rang just as she reached the park entrance. Julian's name appeared on the screen. Hello, she answered, trying to keep her voice steady. Claire, are you all right? Julian's voice was warm with concern. You sound upset. I'm fine, Claire lied, then immediately corrected herself. Actually, no, I'm not fine. I just had a delightful conversation with my father about how pleased he is that I've managed to secure such an advantageous connection with you. Julian was quiet for a moment. I see. And I'm guessing that conversation didn't go well. He essentially accused me of being a gold digger who couldn't possibly interest a man like you based on my own merits, Claire said, the hurt evident in her voice despite her efforts to sound unaffected. Claire, Julian said gently, your father's opinions don't change anything between us, you know that, right? But even as he said it, Claire could hear something in Julian's tone, a careful distance that hadn't been there during their dinner the night before. The magazine article had changed things, whether he wanted to admit it or not. Do I? Claire asked quietly. Because suddenly everyone in New York is going to be watching us, speculating about your motivations and mine. And I can't help wondering if part of you is starting to question whether I'm really as different from other women as you thought. That's ridiculous, Julian said. But Claire noticed he didn't sound entirely convinced. Is it? Claire pressed. Because right now I feel like I'm being turned into exactly the kind of society accessory I've spent my entire adult life trying to avoid becoming. The silence that followed was telling. Julian was a man who built his success on quick decisions and confident assertions, but Claire's question had clearly caught him off guard. I think, Claire said carefully, that we both need some time to think about whether whatever is happening between us can survive this kind of scrutiny. Claire, don't, Julian started, but she had already ended the call. As she walked deeper into Central Park, Claire realized that her worst fears about getting involved with a man like Julian were already coming true. The publicity, her father's machinations, the inevitable speculation about her motives, all of it was threatening to destroy something that had barely begun to bloom. What she didn't know was that at that same moment, Julian was standing in his office 30 floors above Manhattan, staring at his phone and realizing that he was about to lose the most interesting woman he had ever met, because he hadn't been brave enough to fight for her when it mattered most. And for the first time in his adult life, Julian Moray was beginning to understand that some things were worth more than maintaining careful control over his public image. 3 days had passed since Claire's conversation with Julian in Central Park, and she had successfully avoided all his attempts to reach her. The flowers that arrived daily, each arrangement more beautiful than the last, went straight to her building's lobby for other residents to enjoy. The handwritten notes remained unopened on her kitchen counter, a testament to her determination to maintain emotional distance. But when Camilla called with news that the Morrison Gallery was hosting an opening for a new exhibition of contemporary Swiss artists, complete with several pieces Claire had helped acquire during her time in Europe, she couldn't resist the opportunity to reconnect with work that had once brought her genuine satisfaction. "It will be good for you," Camilla insisted, as they walked through the gallery's pristine white spaces, champagne glasses in hand. "You need to remember who you were before Julian Moray complicated your life." Claire was examining a piece she had personally tracked down in Geneva, a haunting landscape by an unknown artist who had died in obscurity, when she felt that familiar electric awareness that meant Julian was nearby. She turned slowly to find him standing near the gallery entrance, and her breath caught at the sight of him. He was dressed in a perfectly tailored black suit that emphasized his broad shoulders and lean build, his dark hair slightly windswept, as if he had rushed to get there. But it was his expression that made her pulse quicken. He was scanning the room with the focused intensity of a man on a mission, and when his amber eyes finally found hers across the crowded space, she felt the impact like a physical force. For a moment, they simply looked at each other across the room, the noise and movement of the gallery opening fading into background. Then Julian began moving toward her with purposeful strides, navigating through the crowd of art enthusiasts and society figures with practiced ease. "Claire," he said when he reached her, his voice low and warm despite the uncertainty in his eyes. "I was hoping I'd find you here." "Julian," she replied, fighting to keep her voice steady. "I'm surprised to see you at an art opening. I didn't realize contemporary Swiss landscapes were among your interests." "They weren't," Julian admitted, his gaze never leaving her face, "until I learned that someone I care about had a hand in bringing them to New York." Before Claire could respond to that loaded statement, Camilla appeared at her elbow with barely concealed excitement. "Julian," she said brightly, extending her hand, "I don't think we've been properly introduced. I'm Camilla Evans, Claire's best friend and the person responsible for getting her onto that auction stage." Julian shook her hand with a genuine smile. "In that case, I owe you a considerable debt of gratitude." "Oh, I like him," Camilla announced to Claire with obvious approval. "He's much more charming in person than he appears in those intimidating business magazine photos." Claire felt heat rise in her cheeks, mortified by her friend's lack of subtlety. But Julian seemed genuinely amused rather than offended by Camilla's directness. "I hope that's a good thing," he said, with a self-deprecating smile. "Definitely," Camilla replied, then turned to Claire with a meaningful look. "I'm going to go find the curator and let him know you're here. I'm sure he'd love to hear about your work on the Geneva acquisition." As Camilla disappeared into the crowd, Claire and Julian were left standing alone in front of the Swiss landscape, the silence between them charged with unspoken words and unresolved tension. "You've been avoiding me," Julian said finally, his tone carefully neutral. "I've been thinking," Claire corrected, still not looking at him directly, "about what you said regarding complications." "And what conclusions have you reached?" Julian asked, moving slightly closer to her. Before Claire could answer, a smooth masculine voice interrupted them from behind. "Claire Belmont, as I live and breathe. I thought that was you across the room." Claire turned to find Marcus Whitfield approaching with the confident stride of a man accustomed to being the center of attention. Tall, blonde, and impeccably groomed, Marcus was exactly the kind of man her father would approve of. Old money, Ivy League education, and a trust fund that eliminated any need for actual employment. "Marcus," Claire said with forced politeness, "what a surprise." Marcus leaned in to kiss her cheek, his hand lingering on her waist longer than necessary. "You look absolutely stunning, as always. I heard through the grapevine that you were back in New York. We simply must catch up properly." Claire felt Julian's presence beside her grow more tense, though his expression remained carefully controlled. She made introductions with reluctant courtesy. "Marcus Whitfield. This is Julian Moray. Julian, Marcus and I knew each other before I moved to Switzerland. The two men shook hands with the kind of polite formality that barely concealed mutual assessment. Julian's grip was firm and confident, while Marcus's smile had the calculating quality of someone sizing up potential competition. Julian Moray, Marcus repeated with obvious recognition. The aviation mogul. I've read about your company's expansion plans. Quite impressive. Thank you, Julian replied with professional courtesy that didn't quite reach his eyes. Marcus turned his attention back to Claire, his hand moving to rest possessively on her lower back. Claire, I was just thinking about that wonderful summer we spent in the Hamptons before you disappeared to Europe. Remember that party at the Wellingtons estate where you spilled wine on Senator Morrison's wife? Claire felt Julian's sharp attention on her as Marcus launched into a series of shared memories clearly designed to establish his prior claim on her attention. With each anecdote, Marcus moved imperceptibly closer to her, his touches becoming more frequent and familiar. Julian watched this display with growing irritation, recognizing Marcus's tactics for exactly what they were, a territorial challenge disguised as friendly conversation. The casual way Marcus touched Claire, the intimate tone he used when referring to their shared past, the obvious assumption that he had some sort of established relationship with her. All of it made Julian's jaw clench with barely controlled jealousy. How wonderful that you two have such fond memories, Julian said finally, his voice carrying just enough edge to make Marcus's smile falter slightly. Though I'm sure Claire has many new experiences to share from her time in Europe. Oh yes, Marcus said dismissively, though nothing quite compares to summers in the Hamptons, does it, darling? He squeezed Claire's waist for emphasis. Speaking of which, Mother is hosting her annual gala next month. You simply must come as my guest, Claire. It will be just like old times. Claire felt trapped between the two men, uncomfortable with Marcus's presumptuous familiarity and acutely aware of Julian's growing tension beside her. The situation was exactly the kind of social maneuvering she had hoped to avoid by staying away from New York's elite circles. I'm not sure about my schedule, she said diplomatically, trying to step away from Marcus's possessive grip. Nonsense, Marcus persisted. I'll call you tomorrow to discuss the details. I still have your number from before you ran away to play with European art dealers. The dismissive way he referred to her work in Switzerland, as if it had been some sort of extended vacation rather than a meaningful career, made Julian's expression darken noticeably. Claire's work in art acquisition was quite impressive, Julian said with deceptive mildness. I understand she helped authenticate several pieces that had been missing from private collections for decades. Hardly playing. Marcus's smile became more strained as he recognized the subtle challenge in Julian's tone. Of course, I simply meant that it's wonderful she's home now where she belongs. The possessive implications in Marcus's words hung in the air like a challenge. Claire felt the tension between the two men escalating and realized she needed to diffuse the situation before it became a scene worthy of tomorrow's gossip columns. Excuse me, she said firmly, stepping away from both men. I need to speak with the curator about the Geneva piece. As she walked away, she could feel both sets of eyes following her retreat. What she couldn't see was the way Julian and Marcus continued to regard each other with barely concealed hostility, each recognizing the other as a serious threat to his own interests. And what none of them noticed was the society photographer discreetly capturing the entire exchange from across the room, already composing tomorrow's headline about the apparent love triangle involving New York's most eligible bachelor. Claire managed to avoid both Julian and Marcus for the remainder of the gallery opening, but she couldn't shake the image of the two men sizing each other up like rival predators. When Camilla suggested they slip out early for a late dinner, Claire gratefully accepted, hoping to put some distance between herself and the complicated emotions the evening had stirred up. They were walking toward the restaurant when Claire's phone buzzed with a text from Julian. We need to talk. About Marcus, about us, about everything I should have said days ago. Is that Loverboy? Camilla asked, peering over Claire's shoulder at the message. Don't call him that, Claire said, but she was already typing back, tomorrow. Coffee. Our usual place. 10 a.m. Julian's response was immediate. I'll be there. Good, Camilla said with satisfaction, because watching Julian Moray get jealous over Marcus Whitfield was better than any soap opera. I thought he was going to challenge Marcus to pistols at dawn. Julian wasn't jealous, Claire protested, though the memory of his darkening expression when Marcus touched her sent an unwelcome thrill through her chest. Honey, Camilla said with the patience of someone explaining basic facts to a child. Julian looked at Marcus like he wanted to throw him out the gallery window. That is not the expression of a man who's casually interested. The next morning, Claire arrived at the coffee shop 10 minutes early, hoping to claim their usual corner table and prepare herself mentally for what was likely to be a difficult conversation. But Julian was already there, looking like he had been waiting for much longer than 10 minutes. He stood as she approached, and Claire was struck again by his commanding presence, the way he seemed to create his own gravitational field that drew attention from everyone in the room. But there was something different about his expression this morning, a vulnerability she hadn't seen before mixed with determination. "Thank you for agreeing to see me," he said, as she settled into the chair across from him. "Julian, about last night," Claire began, but he held up a hand to stop her. "Let me go first," he said, his amber eyes meeting hers directly. "I've spent the last 3 days thinking about what you said in the park, and I realized you were right about some things. The publicity, your father's expectations, the way my world tends to complicate everything, it's all true, and I'm sorry I didn't acknowledge that immediately." Claire felt some of her defensive tension begin to ease. "Thank you for saying that. But," Julian continued, leaning forward slightly, "I need you to know that none of those complications change how I feel about you. And watching Marcus Whitfield put his hands on you last night made me realize something else." "What's that?" Claire asked, though her pulse was already quickening at the intensity in his voice. "I'm falling in love with you," Julian said simply, his words hitting her like a physical force. "Not with Richard Belmont's daughter or some idealized version of who I think you should be, but with you, the woman who challenges me, who sees through my corporate facade, who chose integrity over convenience, even when it meant starting over in a foreign country." Claire felt her breath catch, the coffee shop seeming to fade around them as Julian's words sank in. "Julian, I'm not finished," he said gently. "I also realized that if I don't fight for this, for us, I'm going to spend the rest of my life regretting it. So I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." "All right," Claire said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you have feelings for Marcus Whitfield?" Julian asked, his jaw tight with barely controlled emotion. "No," Claire said immediately, the firmness of her response surprising them both. "Marcus represents everything I ran away from: expectations, social obligations, a life where women are ornamental rather than essential." Julian's expression softened with visible relief. "And do you have feelings for me?" Claire looked into his amber eyes and saw her future hanging in the balance of her answer. The safe choice would be to lie, to protect herself from the vulnerability that came with admitting she was falling for a man whose world could so easily consume her own identity. Instead, she chose truth. "Yes," she said quietly, "I'm falling in love with you too, and it terrifies me." Julian's smile was like sunrise breaking through storm clouds. He reached across the table to take her hand, his fingers interlacing with hers in a gesture that felt both natural and momentous. "It terrifies me too," he admitted. "I built my entire adult life around maintaining control, avoiding emotional complications that could interfere with business. And then you walked onto that auction stage and turned everything upside down." Before Claire could respond, disaster struck in the form of an overly enthusiastic coffee shop patron who collided with their table while gesturing wildly during a phone conversation. Julian's coffee cup overturned, sending hot liquid cascading directly toward Claire's lap. Julian moved with reflexes, honed by years of piloting aircraft in emergency situations. In one fluid motion, he shot out of his chair, grabbed napkins from the neighboring table, and threw himself practically into Claire's lap to prevent the scalding coffee from reaching her. The result was Julian Moret, Billionaire CEO and normally dignified businessman, sprawled across Claire's chair with his arms wrapped around her waist, his face inches from hers, while coffee dripped steadily from the table onto the floor around them. For a moment, they were frozen in that position, Julian's protective instincts having overridden any concern for his own dignity or the spectacle they were creating. Claire could feel his rapid heartbeat against her chest, could see the genuine concern in his amber eyes, as he searched her face for signs of injury. "Are you hurt?" he asked urgently, seemingly oblivious to their awkward position. "I'm fine," Claire managed, though she was anything but fine. Having Julian this close, feeling his strong arms around her, seeing the way he had instinctively moved to protect her without any thought for himself, it was doing dangerous things to her resolve to maintain emotional distance. "Sir, I am so sorry," the phone conversation culprit was saying, hovering nearby with obvious mortification. "Let me get towels, call for help, pay for dry cleaning." Julian finally seemed to realize their position and carefully disentangled himself, though he kept one protective hand on Claire's shoulder as he assured the apologetic customer that no harm had been done. As coffee shop staff materialized with towels and apologies, Julian focused entirely on making sure Claire was comfortable and uninjured. He borrowed a clean shirt from the shop manager, wrapped his jacket around her shoulders when she shivered slightly, and generally treated the minor incident as if she had narrowly escaped a serious catastrophe. "Julian," Claire said with barely suppressed laughter as he examined her hands for invisible burns. "It was coffee, not molten lava. Hot coffee can cause serious burns," Julian said seriously, his protective instincts clearly still in high alert mode. "And your safety is not something I'm willing to take chances with." The fierce protectiveness in his voice made Claire's chest tighten with warmth. She had never had someone react to her well-being with such immediate, instinctive concern, as if her safety mattered more than his own dignity or comfort. "Thank you," she said softly, covering his hands with hers to still his worried examination, "for protecting me, even if it did result in you diving across a coffee shop like an action hero." Julian looked down at their joined hands, then back at her face and slowly smiled. "I would dive across a lot more than a coffee shop to keep you safe." The simple declaration, delivered with absolute sincerity, broke through the last of Claire's carefully maintained defenses. This man, this powerful, successful, intimidatingly competent man, had just made himself look completely ridiculous to protect her from spilled coffee. And in that moment, Claire realized she was completely, irrevocably, hopelessly in love with Julian Moray. The only question was whether she was brave enough to admit it. 2 weeks had passed since the coffee shop incident, and Claire found herself settling into a rhythm with Julian that felt both natural and thrilling. Their relationship had evolved beyond formal dinners into something more intimate. Afternoon walks through Central Park, impromptu lunches at hidden gems throughout the city, long conversations that stretched into the evening hours. But it was Julian's invitation to watch the sunset from a private rooftop in Midtown that marked a turning point neither of them had anticipated. "How do you have access to this?" Claire asked as Julian led her up the final flight of stairs to the roof of a sleek office building she didn't recognize. "I own it," Julian said simply, pushing open the door to reveal a stunning panoramic view of Manhattan stretching out in every direction. Claire stepped onto the rooftop and felt her breath catch. The space had been transformed into an urban oasis, comfortable seating areas arranged around a small fire pit, strings of lights creating a warm ambiance, and planters filled with flowers and herbs that somehow thrived despite being 30 floors above street level. "Julian, this is incredible," she said, turning in a slow circle to take in the 360-degree view of the city as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. "I had it designed as a retreat," Julian explained, leading her to a comfortable seating area that faced west toward the Hudson River. "Somewhere to escape when the office feels too confining." As they settled onto the plush outdoor sofa, Claire found herself acutely aware of Julian's proximity. The warmth radiating from his body, the subtle scent of his cologne mixed with something uniquely him, the way the evening light caught the amber flecks in his eyes. "Tell me something I don't know about you," Claire said as Julian opened a bottle of wine that had been waiting in a discreet cooler nearby. Julian considered the request as he poured their wine, his expression growing thoughtful. "When I was 12, I wanted to be an astronaut," he said finally. "I had the whole plan mapped out, MIT for engineering, then NASA, then eventually the International Space Station." "What changed your mind?" Claire asked, genuinely curious about this glimpse into Julian's childhood dreams. "Reality," Julian said, with a self-deprecating smile. "I realized that astronauts don't generally get to pilot their own spacecraft. They're passengers on someone else's mission. I wanted to be in control of where I was going." Claire studied his profile as he gazed out at the city below them, understanding for the first time the deep-seated need for control that drove so many of Julian's choices. And now you control aircraft and business empires instead of spacecraft. Something like that, Julian agreed, though lately I've been learning that some things are worth giving up control for. The way he looked at her as he said it made Claire's pulse quicken. The conversation was veering into dangerous territory, the kind of emotional honesty that would make it impossible to retreat back to safer ground. Your turn, Julian said. Tell me something I don't know about you. Claire was quiet for a moment, swirling the wine in her glass as she considered what truth to offer. I used to paint, she said finally. Before I got involved in art acquisition, I actually created art myself. Used to? Julian asked, noting the past tense. I stopped when I realized I wasn't particularly good at it, Claire said with forced lightness. It seemed better to help other people's art find appreciative audiences than to inflict my own mediocrity on the world. Julian set down his wine glass and turned to face her more fully. Show me. What? Claire asked, startled by the intensity of his request. Your paintings. I want to see them. Julian, I told you. You told me you thought you weren't good enough, Julian interrupted gently. That's not the same thing as actually being bad at something, and I've learned to trust your aesthetic judgment, so I'm curious about what you create when you're not evaluating other people's work. Claire felt heat rise in her cheeks. I don't have any recent work. I haven't painted in over 2 years. Then paint something new, Julian said, as if it were the most natural suggestion in the world. I'll provide the supplies, the space, whatever you need. Why? Claire asked, genuinely puzzled by his investment in her abandoned hobby. Julian reached over and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, the simple gesture sending electricity down her spine. Because I want to know all of you, Claire. The parts you share easily and the parts you keep hidden. The successes and the dreams you gave up on. All of it. The vulnerability in his voice was almost her undoing. Claire had spent so many years protecting herself from exactly this kind of emotional exposure, and now Julian was asking her to voluntarily lower every defense she had carefully constructed. You realize you're asking me to trust you with pieces of myself I haven't shared with anyone, she said quietly. I know, Julian replied, his amber eyes holding hers steadily, and I'm hoping you realize I wouldn't ask for that trust if I didn't intend to protect it. As the sun continued its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink, Claire found herself studying Julian's face in the golden light. He was looking at her as if she were the most fascinating puzzle he had ever encountered, not with the calculating assessment of a businessman, but with genuine wonder and growing affection. The sunset is beautiful, she said, though she hadn't looked away from his face. Yes, Julian agreed, though his gaze never left hers. Beautiful. The air between them seemed to shimmer with possibility as Julian leaned slightly closer, his hand coming up to cup her cheek with gentle fingers. Claire's breath caught as she realized he was going to kiss her. Finally, after weeks of careful restraint and building tension. Claire, he said softly, her name like a question on his lips. Instead of answering with words, Claire leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering closed as Julian's thumb traced the line of her cheekbone. She could feel his breath warm against her lips, could sense the careful control he was exercising to give her the chance to pull away if she wanted to. But pulling away was the last thing Claire wanted. She had spent weeks fighting her attraction to Julian, telling herself that getting involved with him would compromise her independence and expose her to the kind of emotional manipulation she had experienced with her father. But sitting here in the golden evening light, feeling the tenderness in Julian's touch and seeing the genuine affection in his eyes, those fears seemed distant and irrelevant. Julian's lips were just a breath away from hers when Claire's phone rang with shrill insistence, shattering the intimate moment like glass. They broke apart reluctantly, both breathing harder than the almost kiss warranted, and Claire fumbled for her phone with trembling fingers. I'm sorry, she said, seeing her father's name on the caller ID. It might be important. Julian nodded, though Claire could see the frustration and disappointment in his expression as she answered the call. Claire, where are you? Richard Belmont's voice was sharp with disapproval. Marcus Whitfield called looking for you. Apparently you never responded to his invitation for the Hamptons Gala, and he's concerned that you're being influenced by unsuitable people. Claire closed her eyes, feeling the spell of the evening beginning to disintegrate under the weight of her father's expectations and Marcus's presumptions. "I'm having dinner, Father," she said carefully, very aware of Julian listening to her side of the conversation, "and I haven't responded to Marcus because I'm not interested in attending his mother's party." "Don't be foolish, Claire," Richard said, in the patronizing tone that never failed to make her feel like a recalcitrant child. "The Whitfield connection could be very beneficial for your future. Marcus comes from good family, has excellent prospects." "I have to go," Claire said, ending the call before her father could continue his sales pitch for Marcus's virtues. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of unspoken complications. Julian's expression had grown carefully neutral, and Claire could see him rebuilding the emotional walls that had been crumbling throughout the evening. "I should take you home," Julian said finally, his voice polite but distant. "Julian, please don't," Claire started, but he was already standing, effectively ending the conversation. As they made their way back down to street level, Claire felt the evening's magic slipping away like sand through her fingers. The almost kiss had been a moment of perfect possibility, a chance for them to finally acknowledge the feelings that had been building between them for weeks. But her father's call had reminded them both of the complicated realities that surrounded their relationship, the social expectations, the family pressures, the fundamental question of whether their feelings for each other could survive in the harsh light of public scrutiny. As Julian's car pulled up to her building, Claire turned to face him, desperate to salvage something from the evening that had started with such promise. "Julian," she said softly, placing her hand over his. "What happened tonight was a mistake," Julian finished, though his eyes told a different story. "You were right the first time, Claire. This is too complicated." But even as he said it, Julian's thumb was stroking over her knuckles in a gesture that contradicted his words completely. And as Claire stepped out of the car, she realized that Julian Moray was fighting the same internal battle she was, torn between what his head told him was prudent and what his heart insisted was worth fighting for. The question was, which would ultimately win? Claire spent the next 3 days replaying the almost kiss on Julian's rooftop, analyzing every word, every gesture, every moment when their eyes had met with electric intensity. The rational part of her brain insisted that Julian had been right to pull back, that his comment about their situation being too complicated was simply realistic. But her heart refused to accept that explanation, especially when she remembered the way he had looked at her as the sun set over Manhattan, like she was something precious and irreplaceable. She was attempting to lose herself in contract reviews at her father's office when Camilla burst in without knocking, holding her iPad with barely contained outrage. "Have you seen this?" Camilla demanded, dropping the device on Claire's desk with the browser open to a gossip website. "Because you're going to want to sit down." The headline made Claire's stomach plummet. "Julian Moray steps out with international supermodel Anastasia Volkov." Below it was a series of photographs showing Julian and a stunning blonde woman emerging from an expensive restaurant in Soho, her hand resting familiarly on his arm as they walked to his car. Claire stared at the images, feeling something cold and sharp twist in her chest. Anastasia Volkov was everything Claire was not: tall, impossibly beautiful, with the kind of sophisticated glamour that graced magazine covers worldwide. In the photos, she looked perfectly at home on Julian's arm, as if she belonged in his world in ways Claire never could. "When were these taken?" Claire asked, her voice carefully controlled. "Last night," Camilla said gently, settling into the chair across from Claire's desk. "But honey, you know how these gossip sites work. They could have been having a perfectly innocent business dinner." "They look quite comfortable together," Claire interrupted, studying the way Anastasia leaned into Julian's space, the easy intimacy of their body language. "Claire," Camilla said firmly, 3 days ago Julian Moray was ready to kiss you on a rooftop at sunset. Men don't go from that to dating supermodels overnight, unless something else is going on." But Claire was already closing the browser, her expression shuddering as she tried to process the images and what they might mean. Had Julian taken her father's phone call as a sign that she wasn't serious about their relationship? Had he decided that pursuing her wasn't worth the complications after all? "I need to get back to work," Claire said, turning her attention determinedly to the contracts on her desk. "Don't do this," Camilla warned. "Don't shut down and pretend you don't care. Call him, talk to him, find out what's really going on." But Claire was already rebuilding the emotional walls that Julian had spent weeks carefully dismantling. "There's nothing to find out, Camilla. Julian made his choice, and apparently it wasn't me." What Claire didn't know was that at that exact moment, Julian was sitting in his office 30 floors above Manhattan, staring at the same photographs with a mixture of frustration and regret that had been eating at him since the previous evening. Dinner with Anastasia had been a business obligation. She was launching her own fashion line and had approached Skyward about a potential partnership for luxury travel experiences. Julian had agreed to the meeting as a professional courtesy, never imagining that photographers would be waiting outside the restaurant or that the innocent encounter would be twisted into evidence of a romantic relationship. But seeing the photos now, Julian realized how they must look to anyone who didn't know the context. Anastasia was undeniably beautiful, and she had a way of positioning herself that made every casual interaction appear intimate. The photographer had captured the moment when she had touched his arm, while making a point about her business plans, making it look like a lover's caress rather than professional emphasis. Julian's assistant knocked on his office door, interrupting his brooding contemplation of the images. "Mr. Moray, Miss Belmont is online too," she announced. Julian's heart leaped with hope and trepidation. "Claire?" "Yes, sir. She says it's urgent." Julian immediately reached for the phone, but what he heard when he answered wasn't Claire's voice. It was Richard Belmont's, cold and businesslike. "Julian, I think we need to have a conversation about your intentions regarding my daughter." "Richard," Julian said carefully, "I'm not sure what you mean." "I mean the photographs in this morning's gossip columns showing you with Anastasia Volkov," Richard replied bluntly. "Claire saw them, and she's understandably upset. I think it's time for some clarity about where you stand." Julian felt anger flare in his chest. "With respect, Richard, my personal life is not your business to manage." "It becomes my business when it affects my daughter's well-being," Richard shot back. "Claire has been through enough emotional upheaval with her return to New York. If you're not serious about pursuing a relationship with her, I suggest you make that clear now before she becomes more invested." The conversation continued for several more uncomfortable minutes, with Richard making thinly veiled suggestions about Julian's obligations and responsibilities. By the time Julian finally ended the call, he was furious, not just at Richard's interference, but at the entire situation that had spiraled so far beyond his control. He needed to see Claire, to explain about Anastasia, to make her understand that the photographs meant nothing compared to what had almost happened between them on the rooftop. But when he called her directly, the phone went straight to voicemail. Julian tried 3 more times throughout the afternoon, each call going unanswered. Finally, he decided on a more direct approach and had his driver take him to her apartment building. But when he arrived, the doorman informed him that Ms. Belmont had left several hours earlier with luggage, mentioning something about needing time away from the city. Julian stood on the sidewalk outside Claire's building as evening fell over Manhattan, realizing that he had lost her without ever really having her. The photographs with Anastasia, her father's interference, the complicated web of expectations and misunderstandings, all of it had conspired to drive Claire away, just when they had been on the verge of something real and significant. For the first time in his adult life, Julian Moray had encountered a problem that couldn't be solved with money, influence, or strategic thinking. Claire Belmont had become the one thing he wanted most in the world, and she was slipping away from him like morning mist. Meanwhile, in a small inn overlooking the Hudson Valley, Claire sat by her window watching the sun set over the mountains, trying to convince herself that leaving the city had been the right decision. The photographs of Julian and Anastasia were burned into her memory, a painful reminder of why she had been right to guard her heart so carefully. But even as she told herself that Julian had simply chosen someone more suitable to his lifestyle, Claire couldn't forget the way he had looked at her on his rooftop, or the way her entire body had responded to his almost kiss with a desperate longing she had never experienced before. She had fled the city to protect herself from further heartbreak, but Claire was beginning to realize that some wounds followed you no matter how far you ran. Claire spent 5 days at the Hudson Valley Inn, walking mountain trails and trying to convince herself that distance from Julian would cure the ache in her chest. But every sunset reminded her of their rooftop evening, and every quiet moment brought back the memory of his amber eyes, looking at her as if she were the answer to questions he had never known how to ask. On the 6th morning, she received a call from Camilla that changed everything. "You need to come back to the city," Camilla said without preamble. "Julian's been looking for you everywhere, and I think you're going to want to hear what he has to say." "Camilla, I told you." "The dinner with Anastasia was business," Camilla interrupted. "I did some investigating and she's launching a fashion line. The meeting was about a potential partnership for luxury travel experiences through Skyward. There were contracts involved, Claire, legal documents. This wasn't a date." Claire felt her carefully constructed resolve begin to waver. "Even if that's true, it doesn't change the fundamental issues between us. My father's expectations, the publicity, the fact that we come from completely different worlds." "Bull," Camilla said bluntly. "Those are excuses and you know it. The real issue is that you're scared of being happy, scared of trusting someone who might actually be worthy of that trust." The words hit Claire like cold water, forcing her to confront truths she had been avoiding. "Camilla, come home, Claire. Whatever this is between you and Julian, it deserves a real conversation, not a retreat into the mountains." 2 hours later, Claire was driving back toward Manhattan, her heart pounding with a mixture of hope and terror. She had no idea what she would say to Julian, no plan for how to navigate the complicated emotions that had been building between them for months. But as the city skyline came into view, Claire realized that some risks were worth taking, even if they meant exposing herself to the possibility of heartbreak. She was so lost in thought that she almost missed her exit, and in her hurry to correct course, she took the wrong turn. Instead of heading toward her apartment, Claire found herself in an unfamiliar part of Queens, surrounded by industrial buildings and airplane hangars. It was only when she saw the familiar Skyward Enterprises logo on a massive hangar that she realized where she was, and that fate might have just provided her with an opportunity she wouldn't have had the courage to seek out deliberately. Claire parked outside the hangar complex, gathering her courage as she walked toward the main building. Through the enormous open doors, she could see several aircraft in various stages of maintenance and the distinctive sound of a powerful engine warming up. "Excuse me," she said to a mechanic who looked up as she approached. "I'm looking for Julian Moret. Is he here?" The man grinned and pointed toward the runway visible through the back of the hangar. "Mr. Moret's taking the Cessna up for a test flight. Should be back down in about 20 minutes if you want to wait." Claire walked to the back of the hangar and found herself looking out at a private runway where a sleek aircraft was just touching down with practiced precision. As the plane taxied toward the hangar, Claire felt her pulse quicken with the realization that Julian was piloting the aircraft himself. She watched, mesmerized, as the plane came to a stop, and Julian emerged from the cockpit with fluid grace. He was dressed in casual clothes, dark jeans and a leather jacket, and his dark hair was slightly windswept from the flight. There was something different about his bearing here in his element, a confidence that seemed even more natural than his boardroom authority. Julian was pulling off his headset when he looked up and saw Claire standing in the hangar doorway. For a moment, they simply stared at each other across the distance, the airplane engines and mechanical sounds fading into background noise. "Claire," Julian said, his voice carrying clearly in the vast space as he walked toward her with long, purposeful strides. "Hello, Julian," she replied, suddenly uncertain about her decision to come here. "I hope you don't mind the intrusion. I got lost and ended up—" "You're never an intrusion," Julian said, stopping just close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his amber eyes. "I've been trying to reach you for days." "I know," Claire said quietly. "I needed time to think." Julian studied her face, noting the shadows under her eyes that suggested she had slept about as well as he had over the past week. "About the photographs with Anastasia." "Camilla explained about the business meeting," Claire interrupted. "I'm sorry I jumped to conclusions without talking to you first." "Don't apologize," Julian said firmly. "I should have called you immediately, should have explained the situation before you saw those pictures. I never meant for you to think—" He ran a hand through his hair in frustration. "I've been handling this entire situation badly from the beginning." They were interrupted by one of Julian's mechanics approaching with a clipboard. "Mr. Moret, the pre-flight inspection on the Gulfstream is complete. She's ready whenever you are." Julian glanced at the man, then back at Claire, and she saw something shift in his expression, a decision being made in real time. "Actually, Tom, I'm going to take a different passenger up today," Julian said, his eyes never leaving Claire's face. "Cancel the business flight and prep the Cessna instead." "Julian, what are you doing?" Claire asked, though her pulse was already quickening with anticipation. "Something I should have done weeks ago," Julian replied, extending his hand toward her. "I'm going to show you why flying matters to me, why the sky is the only place I've ever felt completely free. And then I'm going to tell you some things I should have said on that rooftop." Claire looked at his outstretched hand, then at the small aircraft waiting on the runway, then back at Julian's face, where she saw hope and determination warring with uncertainty. "I've never been in a small plane," she admitted. "I've been flying for 15 years, Julian said simply. "You'll be safer with me than you are driving on the highway." The absolute confidence in his voice, combined with the vulnerability she could see in his eyes, made Claire's decision for her. She placed her hand in his, feeling the familiar electric connection that sparked every time they touched. "All right," she said. "Show me your sky." 20 minutes later, Claire found herself strapped into the co-pilot seat of Julian's Cessna, watching with fascination as he went through his pre-flight routine with the methodical precision of someone who had performed these same checks thousands of times. "Nervous?" Julian asked as they received clearance for takeoff. "Surprisingly, no," Claire realized. "I trust you." The simple statement hit Julian with unexpected force. Claire Belmont, who guarded her trust like a precious resource, who had every reason to be cautious about powerful men and their promises, trusted him with her safety, her life, her vulnerability. As the plane lifted off from the runway and climbed into the afternoon sky, Claire felt her breath catch at the beauty spread out below them. Manhattan looked like a glittering jewel from this height, the Hudson River winding through the landscape like a silver ribbon. "It's incredible," she said, turning to look at Julian's profile as he navigated them through the airspace around the city. "Wait until we get above the clouds," Julian replied, his voice warm with the pleasure of sharing something he loved with someone who mattered to him. When they finally leveled off at cruising altitude, with nothing but blue sky and endless horizons stretching in every direction, Julian turned to face Claire directly. "This is where I come when the world gets too complicated," he said. "Up here there's just me and the machine, and the laws of physics. No board meetings, no social expectations, no careful strategies. Just pure freedom." Claire understood immediately why this mattered to him, why a man who had built his life around control and calculated risk would crave this elemental simplicity. "Thank you for bringing me here," she said softly. "Claire," Julian said, his voice taking on the serious tone that meant important conversations were ahead, "there are things I need to tell you, about why I pulled back after your father called, about what you mean to me, about what I want this to be between us." As they flew through the endless blue afternoon, with the world spread out far below them, Claire realized that Julian was about to offer her his heart, 30,000 feet above the complications and expectations that had driven them apart. The only question was whether she was brave enough to accept it. At 30,000 feet above the Atlantic Ocean, with nothing but endless blue sky surrounding them, Julian finally found the courage to say everything he had been holding back for months. "I love you," he said simply, his hands steady on the aircraft controls even as his heart hammered against his ribs. "I'm completely, irrevocably in love with you, Claire, and I need you to know that before I say anything else." Claire felt her breath catch, the declaration hitting her with the force of absolute truth. Up here, removed from all the complications and expectations that had clouded their relationship on the ground, Julian's words carried a clarity that made her chest tighten with overwhelming emotion. "Julian," she started, but he continued before she could respond. "I pulled back after your father called because I was scared," Julian admitted, his amber eyes meeting hers briefly before returning to the horizon. "Scared that I was becoming exactly the kind of controlling man you've spent your life trying to escape from. Scared that my feelings for you were so intense they would end up suffocating you." "And now?" Claire asked quietly. "Now I realize that loving someone means being willing to fight for them, even when, especially when, the world seems determined to keep you apart." Julian's voice grew stronger, more determined. "I don't want to control you, Claire. I want to support you. I want to be the person you choose to share your life with, not because of social expectations or family pressure, but because we make each other better people." Claire looked out at the vast expanse of sky surrounding them, understanding for the first time why Julian had brought her here. Up in this limitless blue, the fears and complications that had seemed so insurmountable on the ground appeared small and manageable. "I love you too," she said, the words emerging with surprising ease now that she had stopped fighting them. "I've been in love with you since that night at the River Cafe, when you challenged me to trust you with more than just dinner conversation." Julian's smile transformed his entire expression, and for a moment Claire thought he might actually abandon the aircraft controls to kiss her. Instead, he reached over and took her hand, bringing her fingers to his lips for a gentle kiss that sent warmth racing up her arm. "What happens now?" Claire asked, suddenly aware of all the practical considerations waiting for them back on the ground. "Now," Julian said, beginning a gradual descent toward the private airfield where they had taken off, "we stop letting other people dictate our choices. Your father's expectations, society's opinions, the gossip columnists who seem determined to narrate our relationship, none of that matters compared to what we feel for each other." As the aircraft touched down with Julian's characteristic precision, Claire realized that something fundamental had shifted between them during their time above the clouds. The careful distance they had both maintained, the protective walls they had constructed, all of it had been stripped away by honesty and the rare clarity that came from being completely removed from ordinary concerns. Julian taxied the plane back to the hangar, going through his post-flight routine with the same methodical care he had shown before takeoff. But Claire could see the difference in his bearing. The tension he had carried for weeks was gone, replaced by the quiet confidence of a man who had finally decided to stop second-guessing his own heart. "There's something I want to show you," Julian said as they climbed down from the aircraft. He led her to a section of the hangar she hadn't seen before, where a larger aircraft, a sleek corporate jet, was undergoing maintenance. But it wasn't the plane itself that made Claire's breath catch. It was the name painted in elegant script along the fuselage. "Claire's Dream." "Julian," she whispered, reaching out to touch the letters with trembling fingers. How long has this been here?" "I commissioned it 3 weeks ago," Julian said, his voice soft with vulnerability. "After our dinner in the village, when you talked about wanting to build something meaningful rather than just running away, I thought maybe we could build something together, starting with giving you a way to reach any destination your dreams might take you." Claire turned to face him, tears blurring her vision as the magnitude of his gesture sank in. This wasn't just an expensive gift, it was a declaration of faith in their future, a tangible symbol of Julian's belief that what they had together was worth investing in permanently. "I can't accept this," she said, though her protest lacked conviction. "You're not accepting a gift," Julian said, stepping closer to her. "You're accepting a partnership. This plane, like everything else I want to share with you, belongs to us. Our adventures, our dreams, our future." Before Claire could respond with all the practical objections crowding her mind, Julian cupped her face in his hands and finally kissed her with all the passion and tenderness that had been building between them for months. The kiss was everything their almost moment on the rooftop had promised and more. Claire felt herself melting against Julian's chest as his lips moved over hers with gentle insistence, conveying everything he felt for her in ways that words could never capture. She could taste his relief, his love, his absolute certainty that this was where they both belonged. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Julian rested his forehead against hers and smiled with pure joy. "Marry me," he said, the proposal emerging with the same natural inevitability as his earlier declaration of love. Claire's eyes widened in surprise, though her heart was already singing with the rightness of his words. "Julian." "I know it's sudden," Julian said quickly, "and I know we still have things to figure out, but I also know that I want to spend the rest of my life loving you, protecting you, supporting your dreams, and building something beautiful together. Everything else is just details." Claire looked into his amber eyes and saw their entire future spread out like the endless sky they had just flown through, full of possibility, adventure, and the kind of deep, abiding love she had never dared to hope for. "Yes," she said, her voice strong and certain despite the tears streaming down her cheeks. "Yes, Julian, I'll marry you." As Julian pulled her into his arms for another kiss, Claire realized that sometimes the most important journeys began not with careful planning or calculated risks, but with the simple courage to say yes to love when it appeared in your life like an unexpected gift. And as the afternoon sun slanted through the hangar windows, illuminating the aircraft that bore her name, and the man who had just promised to love her forever, Claire Belmont finally understood that coming home to New York had never been about returning to her old life. It had been about finding the courage to build a new one with the person who made her feel completely, perfectly free. 3 weeks after Julian's proposal in the hangar, Claire found herself standing in front of her bedroom mirror, adjusting the drape of the sapphire blue gown Julian had chosen for the Children's Hope Foundation gala at Carnegie Hall. The irony wasn't lost on her that they were returning to where their story had begun, a charity event where Julian would bid on something precious to help children in need. This time, however, Julian wouldn't be bidding on a dinner date. Tonight, he planned to make a public declaration that would leave no doubt about his intentions regarding Claire Belmont. "You look absolutely radiant," Camilla said from the doorway, resplendent in her own evening gown. "That shade of blue makes your eyes look like jewels." Claire touched the engagement ring Julian had surprised her with, just days after his proposal, a vintage emerald surrounded by diamonds that had belonged to his grandmother. It was elegant and understated, exactly what she would have chosen for herself if she had been brave enough to dream of such things. "I'm nervous," Claire admitted, turning away from the mirror. "Tonight feels so public, so official." "That's because it is," Camilla said with a grin. "Julian Moray doesn't take a woman to Carnegie Hall as his official date unless he's making a statement. And based on the guest list for tonight, that statement is going to be heard by everyone who matters in New York society." An hour later, Claire stood at Julian's side in the grand foyer of Carnegie Hall, accepting congratulations from a steady stream of New York's elite. The engagement announcement had appeared in the morning's social pages, complete with a photograph of them at the hangar that managed to capture both the intimacy of their relationship and the magnitude of Julian's romantic gesture. Julian's hand rested protectively on her lower back as they navigated through the crowd, and Claire was struck by how naturally they moved together, as if they had been attending events as a couple for years, rather than making their official debut. "Claire, darling," the voice belonged to Mrs. Wellington, one of New York's most prominent society matrons. "You must tell us all about this whirlwind romance. Julian has been Manhattan's most eligible bachelor for so long, we had begun to think he was permanently unavailable." "Julian is definitely worth the wait," Claire replied diplomatically, feeling Julian's fingers squeeze her waist in appreciation of her tactful response. As the evening progressed, Claire found herself genuinely enjoying the interactions with Julian's colleagues and friends. Unlike her father's business associates, who had always made her feel like an ornamental afterthought, Julian's circle treated her as an equal partner in the relationship. But it was when they encountered Marcus Whitfield near the champagne reception that the evening took on a different tone entirely. "Claire," Marcus said with his practiced smile, though Claire could see the calculation in his eyes as he assessed her engagement ring and Julian's protective proximity. "Congratulations on your engagement. I must say, it all happened rather quickly." "When you know, you know," Julian replied smoothly, his arm sliding more possessively around Claire's waist. Marcus's smile became more strained. "Of course. I'm sure Claire's father is thrilled about such an advantageous match." The implication in Marcus's words, that Claire's value lay primarily in her usefulness as a business connection, made Julian's expression darken with barely controlled anger. "Claire's father's opinions are irrelevant to our relationship," Julian said with deceptive mildness. "Claire and I chose each other based on love, respect, and genuine partnership. I realize that might be a foreign concept to some people." The subtle insult hit its mark, and Marcus's facade slipped slightly. "Well, I'm sure you'll both be very happy. Claire always did prefer dramatic gestures over practical considerations." Before Julian could respond with words that would definitely make tomorrow's gossip columns, Claire intervened with the diplomatic skills she had learned during her years in Switzerland. "Marcus, I hope you enjoy the rest of the evening," she said pleasantly, effectively dismissing him while maintaining perfect courtesy. As Marcus retreated with wounded dignity, Julian leaned down to whisper in Claire's ear, "Remind me to thank you later for preventing me from causing a scene that would have ended up in every newspaper in the city." "I have my moments," Claire replied with a smile that made Julian's chest tighten with love and admiration. The formal program began shortly afterward, with speeches about the Foundation's work and the impact of the evening's fundraising efforts. But it was when the auctioneer announced a special surprise item that Claire realized Julian had orchestrated something that would dwarf even his $500,000 bid from months earlier. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a unique opportunity tonight," the auctioneer announced. "Mr. Julian Moray has generously donated a private flight experience aboard his corporate jet to any destination in the continental United States, with all proceeds going directly to our educational programs." The bidding started at $50,000 and quickly escalated as various attendees recognized the value of the experience. But when the price reached $200,000, Julian himself raised his hand. $5 million, he said clearly, his voice carrying throughout the suddenly silent auditorium. Gasps echoed through Carnegie Hall as the magnitude of Julian's bid registered. But he wasn't finished. "With one condition," Julian continued, turning to face Claire directly. "The winning bidder gets to choose any destination they like, but they have to take Claire Belmont Moret with them, because as of tonight, she's the only traveling companion I'm interested in having." The room erupted in applause and surprised laughter as Julian's public declaration registered. He had just announced their engagement to the entire gathering in the most Julian Moray way possible, with a grand gesture that also raised millions for charity, while making it absolutely clear that Claire was his chosen partner in all future adventures. "Julian," Claire whispered, her cheeks flushed with emotion and embarrassment at being the center of so much attention. "Too much?" Julian asked quietly, though his amber eyes were dancing with satisfaction at her reaction. "Perfect," Claire said, rising on her toes to kiss him softly, while the audience continued their enthusiastic applause. As the evening wound down, Claire and Julian found themselves on the steps of Carnegie Hall, waiting for his car, while photographers captured their exit. The night air was crisp and clear, and Claire could see stars despite the city's bright lights. "No regrets?" Julian asked, wrapping his jacket around her shoulders against the evening chill. "None," Claire said firmly, leaning into his warmth. "Though I think you may have just redefined the concept of going public with a relationship." Julian laughed, the sound rich and happy in the night air. "I wanted everyone to know that you're not just another woman I'm dating. You're my partner, my equal, my choice for forever, and I wanted you to hear me say that in front of everyone who matters." As they settled into the back of Julian's car for the ride home, Claire reflected on how much her life had changed since that first charity auction. She had gone from running away from powerful men and their expectations to choosing to build a life with one who saw her strength as something to celebrate rather than control. "What are you thinking about?" Julian asked, noting her contemplative expression. "How different this feels from anything I've ever experienced," Claire said honestly. "With you, I don't feel like I'm losing myself or compromising my independence. I feel like I'm becoming more myself than I've ever been." Julian's smile was soft and wondering. "That's exactly how love should feel," he said, bringing her hand to his lips for a gentle kiss. "Like coming home to yourself." As the car carried them through the glittering streets of Manhattan toward their shared future, Claire realized that Julian was absolutely right. She wasn't giving up her independence by marrying him. She was finally free to be completely, authentically herself, with someone who loved her not despite her strength and complexity, but because of it. And tomorrow, they would begin planning not just a wedding, but a lifetime of adventures that would take them anywhere their dreams might lead. 6 months later, Claire stood on the terrace of the penthouse apartment she now shared with Julian, watching the sun set over Manhattan's glittering skyline. Her hand rested protectively over the gentle curve of her belly, barely visible yet, but unmistakably there, as she reviewed the quarterly reports for the Claire Belmont Foundation for Women in Aviation, the non-profit she had established with Julian's support and encouragement. The foundation had exceeded all their initial projections, providing scholarships, mentorship programs, and career development opportunities for women entering the aviation industry. Claire had found her calling in work that combined her organizational skills, her passion for empowering others, and her growing knowledge of the aviation world that had become such an important part of her life. "Working late again?" Julian's voice came from behind her, warm with affection and gentle reproach. Claire turned to find her husband of 3 months approaching with 2 cups of decaffeinated tea, a small accommodation he had made without being asked when they discovered she was pregnant. He was dressed casually in dark jeans and a white button-down shirt, his sleeves rolled up and his hair slightly mussed from his own long day at the office. "The foundation received 3 new scholarship applications today," Claire said, accepting the tea gratefully and leaning into Julian's embrace as he wrapped his arms around her from behind. "I wanted to review them while they were fresh in my mind." Julian pressed a kiss to the top of her head, then rested his chin there as they both looked out at the city lights beginning to twinkle in the gathering dusk. "How are you feeling? Any nausea today?" "Better," Claire admitted, settling back against his chest with a contented sigh. "Dr. Martinez says the morning sickness should start tapering off in another few weeks." "Good," Julian murmured, his hands moving to rest over hers on her belly. "Though I have to admit I've kind of enjoyed having an excuse to pamper you even more than usual." Claire laughed, remembering the lengths Julian had gone to during her worst weeks of morning sickness, bringing her ginger tea in bed, rearranging his schedule to drive her to appointments, even learning to cook her favorite comfort foods when the smell of restaurant takeout became too overwhelming. "You've been wonderful," she said, turning in his arms to face him properly, "though I think your assistant is starting to worry about how much time you're spending away from the office." "My assistant can adjust," Julian said firmly, cupping Claire's face in his hands. "You and our baby are my priorities now. Everything else is just details." The absolute certainty in his voice still amazed Claire, even after months of marriage. Julian approached fatherhood with the same focused intensity he brought to everything else that mattered to him, reading parenting books with the same thoroughness he applied to business contracts, and already planning educational strategies for a child who wouldn't be born for another 6 months. "Speaking of priorities," Claire said with a mischievous smile, "Camilla called today with some interesting news about the wedding photos." "Oh?" Julian asked, though his attention was somewhat distracted by the way the evening light was catching the gold flecks in Claire's eyes. "Apparently Vogue wants to feature our wedding in their next issue," Claire continued. "Something about it being the most romantic aviation-themed wedding of the decade." Julian groaned softly, remembering the elaborate ceremony they had planned for St. Patrick's Cathedral, complete with a flyover by skyward aircraft, and a reception at the Metropolitan Museum of Art that had been featured in every society publication in New York. "Do you regret having such a public wedding?" Julian asked, suddenly serious. "I know you value your privacy, and I sometimes worry that marrying me means giving up more anonymity than you bargained for." Claire considered the question thoughtfully. It was true that her life had become much more public since their engagement. There were photographers at charity events, interviews about the foundation, and constant speculation about their relationship in the society pages. But rather than feeling suffocated by the attention, Claire had found ways to use the visibility to further causes she cared about. "I regret nothing," she said finally, her voice carrying absolute conviction. "This life we've built together, the foundation, the baby we're expecting, all of it feels like the most authentic version of myself I've ever been." Julian's smile was radiant with relief and joy. "I feel the same way. Before you, I thought success meant achieving control over every aspect of my life, but you've taught me that the best things happen when you're brave enough to let love make you vulnerable." As they stood together on their terrace, with Manhattan spread out below them and the first stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky, Claire reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. From that first charity auction, where Julian had paid $500,000 for the privilege of having dinner with her, through all the misunderstandings and complications that had nearly driven them apart, to this perfect evening where they were planning their future as a family. "What are you thinking about?" Julian asked, noting her contemplative expression. "That night at the plaza," Claire said with a soft smile. "When you bid on dinner with me, did you have any idea we would end up here?" Julian was quiet for a moment, his amber eyes growing thoughtful. "Honestly, from the moment I saw you on that stage, some part of me knew you were going to change my life completely. I just didn't realize how much I wanted that change until I almost lost you." "You never would have lost me," Claire said, reaching up to trace the line of his jaw with gentle fingers. "Even when I was running scared, even when everything seemed too complicated, part of me always knew we belonged together." "Always?" Julian asked, catching her hand and pressing it more firmly against his cheek. "Always," Claire confirmed. "You were worth fighting for, Julian. We were worth fighting for." As the evening deepened around them, Julian leaned down to kiss his wife with all the tenderness and passion that had sustained them through courtship, engagement, and the early months of marriage. Claire melted into his embrace, still amazed by the way her body responded to his touch, as if every kiss was both completely familiar and thrillingly new. "I love you," Julian murmured against her lips, the words carrying the weight of promises kept and dreams fulfilled. "I love you too," Claire whispered back, her hands tangling in his dark hair. "Forever and always." When they finally broke apart, both breathing slightly harder, Julian rested his forehead against hers and smiled with pure contentment. "Come to bed with me," he said softly, the request carrying layers of meaning, desire, comfort, the simple pleasure of ending each day in each other's arms. As Claire allowed Julian to lead her inside their beautiful home, past the living room where her paintings now hung alongside his aviation photographs, past the study where they worked side by side on foundation business and skyward expansion plans, toward the bedroom where they had learned to love each other completely and without reservation, she realized that this was what happiness looked like. Not the dramatic passion of movies or novels, but the steady, enduring joy of building a life with someone who saw all of you and chose to love you anyway. Someone who supported your dreams, celebrated your successes, and stood beside you during the challenges that life inevitably brought. Later, as they lay entwined in their bed with Claire's head resting on Julian's chest and his hand protective over their growing baby, Julian spoke into the peaceful darkness. "You taught me that love is not an illusion," he said, echoing the words he had whispered to her on their wedding night. "It's my safe landing." Claire smiled against his chest, understanding completely what he meant. After years of turbulence, family conflicts, professional uncertainties, the constant question of where she truly belonged, she had found her home in Julian's arms. "And you taught me that love doesn't have to mean losing yourself," she replied softly. "Sometimes it means finding yourself in ways you never imagined possible." As sleep began to claim them both, wrapped in the peace of absolute trust and unconditional love, Claire thought about the child they would welcome in just a few months, a baby who would grow up knowing that true love was possible, that partnership meant equality, and that the best adventures in life were the ones shared with people who mattered most. Outside their window, New York continued its restless existence, the city that had witnessed their first meeting, their courtship, their wedding, and now the quiet contentment of their married life. The same city that would watch their children grow, their foundation flourish, and their love deepen with each passing year. But inside their penthouse sanctuary, Claire Belmont-Moret and Julian Moret slept peacefully in each other's arms, secure in the knowledge that they had found something rare and precious, a love that freed rather than constrained, that inspired rather than limited, that promised not just happiness but the courage to keep growing together through all the adventures still to come. And in the morning, they would wake to begin another day of building the beautiful life they had chosen to create together, a life filled with purpose, passion, and the absolute certainty that some love stories really do have perfect endings. Leave your comment and share this story with someone special. It truly helps us keep bringing new stories to you. And if you want to follow every chapter of this emotional journey, subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell. Your support makes all the difference.